The Vorthak Empire had spent the better part of 3 millennia perfecting the art of being absolutely insufferable winners. Across 17 star systems, their black-hulled dreadnoughts cast shadows over worlds that had learned the hard way that resistance was not just futile, it was laughably brief. The Empire operated on a delightfully simple principle: might makes right, and we have all the might, so shut up and pay your tribute. Their capital world of Dominax Prime resembled what would happen if someone gave a particularly violent architect unlimited resources and a serious inferiority complex. Obsidian spires clawed at the crimson sky like desperate fingers, while massive holographic displays broadcasted the Empire's latest conquests to anyone with functioning optical organs. The architecture screamed compensation so loudly that neighboring star systems could probably hear it through the vacuum of space. At the heart of this monument to aggressive overachievement stood the Yigamarki's most cherished institution, the Eternal Arena. Here, the Empire's rigid hierarchy was maintained through a beautifully straightforward system that would make Darwin himself weep with appreciation. Combat prowess determined everything: political rank, mating rights, even who got the good parking spots at government facilities. The Vorthak had taken social Darwinism and beaten it to death with its own logic, then worn its skin as a fashionable hat. The crown jewel of this violent meritocracy was the trial by fang, a ritual so steeped in tradition that the instruction manual had its own instruction manual. Originally conceived as a way to settle disputes without destroying entire planets, which was surprisingly expensive, even for an empire, it had evolved into the ultimate test of supremacy. Winners ascended to positions of power, while losers typically ascended to whatever afterlife awaited creatures with that many puncture wounds. The rules were elegantly simple, which was fortunate because the average Vorthak possessed all the intellectual subtlety of a hyperspace collision. 2 combatants entered the arena, 1 combatant left the arena, the other left in much smaller, easily transportable pieces. No weapons beyond natural biology were permitted, which suited the Vorthak perfectly since they were essentially 8-foot-tall murder machines that evolution had crafted during a particularly vindictive mood. Their physiology read like a wish list compiled by someone who really truly hated the concept of mercy. Retractable claws that could punch through starship hulls, bone density that made titanium feel inadequate about itself, reflexes so fast they bordered on precognitive, backed by muscles that treated the laws of physics more like gentle suggestion. Most impressively, they possessed a redundant nervous system that kept them fighting even after sustaining injuries that would drop a lesser species into convenient unconsciousness. For the past 12 solar cycles, the undisputed champion of this organized brutality was Overlord Yexthan the Inevitable. The title was not hyperbole. In 137 consecutive matches, he had demonstrated an almost artistic commitment to victory that had elevated dismemberment to performance art. His fighting style combined the graceful lethality of a ballet dancer with the stopping power of a singularity bomb, resulting in contests that typically lasted about as long as a particularly violent sneeze. Yexthan had earned his position through a simple process. He had challenged the previous overlord and converted him into abstract art distributed across several square meters of arena floor. The transition of power had been remarkably smooth, primarily because the alternative leadership candidates had suddenly discovered urgent business in distant star systems. The Higamarki treated their champion with the reverence typically reserved for natural disasters or tax audit. His daily routine was documented by historians who presumably wore protective gear while taking notes. His diet, exercise regimen, and preferred methods of intimidation were studied with academic thoroughness by military strategists who hoped to replicate even a fraction of his effectiveness. The betting pools surrounding his matches had become so one-sided that bookmakers had started offering odds on precisely which body part would separate first from his opponents. The smart money was usually on all of them simultaneously, though occasionally some optimist would put credits on just the head, cleanly. This was the status quo that had governed galactic civilization for longer than most species had possessed fire, written language, or the wisdom to avoid annoying the Vorthak Empire. The natural order of things was as fixed and immutable as the fundamental constants of physics, which was exactly how the Higamarki preferred it. So when the diplomatic vessel bearing the registration codes of a previously unknown species entered Dominax Prime's orbital space, the reaction from Imperial Command ranged from mild curiosity to outright amusement. The ship itself was laughably small, barely larger than a Vorthak personal transport and constructed from materials that appeared to prioritize function over the intimidation factor that any civilized vessel should possess. The communication that followed was even more entertaining. The aliens identified themselves as humans and requested an audience to discuss cultural exchange and mutual understanding. The very concept was so adorably naive that several Higamaki officials had to excuse themselves to avoid laughing directly into the transmission. Cultural exchange. As if the Vorthak Empire was some sort of academic institution rather than a carefully orchestrated exercise in applied violence. As if mutual understanding was something that happened between predator and prey, rather than the brief moment of clarity that occurred right before the eating commenced. The humans were about to receive an education in the fundamental nature of galactic civilization, and like all the best lessons, it was going to be delivered in the eternal arena. The Higamaki was practically vibrating with anticipation. Not only would they add another species to their ever-growing collection of subjugated civilizations, but they would do so in the most entertainingly brutal fashion possible. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The Imperial Council chamber on Dominax Prime had hosted many momentous decisions over the millennia: declarations of war, the systematic dismantling of entire civilizations, and the occasional debate over lunch arrangements. But rarely had it witnessed such collective amusement as the day the human diplomatic request was formally reviewed. The laughter echoing off the obsidian walls would have been audible from orbit if anyone had been foolish enough to be listening from such a vulnerable position. High Admiral Grixov, whose collection of enemy skulls served as both furniture and conversation pieces, was the first to compose himself enough to speak. Cultural exchange, he wheezed, wiping tears from his predatory eyes. They want to exchange cultures. What do they imagine we'll trade? Their quaint little customs for our time-tested methods of planetary subjugation. The surrounding council members erupted into fresh waves of hilarity. Defense Minister Kalthex, whose idea of diplomacy involved choosing which orbital bombardment pattern would send the clearest message, slammed a massive fist on the council table with enough force to crack the reinforced surface. Perhaps they'll teach us their primitive art forms in exchange for lessons in advanced intimidation techniques. Supreme War Coordinator Vexnath, who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of violence, leaned back in his throne-like chair. The furniture creaked ominously under his considerable bulk, though whether from his weight or the sheer gravitational pull of his ego was unclear. Has anyone bothered to analyze these humans beyond their amusing diplomatic overture? The intelligence briefing that followed was a masterpiece of condescending analysis. According to Imperial scouts, humans were bipedal mammals averaging 6 feet in height and possessing the sort of delicate physiology that suggested evolution had designed them specifically as prey. They lacked natural weapons, no claws, no fangs, no armored hide that could deflect anything more threatening than harsh criticism. Their bone density was laughably inadequate, their muscle mass embarrassingly modest, and their reflexes so sluggish that they probably needed advance warning to avoid walking into walls. They appear to be omnivores, reported Intelligence Chief Nexariel, consulting his datapad with the sort of professional disdain typically reserved for particularly disappointing tax returns, though they show a disturbing preference for consuming plants. Plants, my lord. They voluntarily eat vegetation when perfectly good meat is available. The Council's reaction suggested that this dietary choice was evidence of either severe mental deficiency or a complete abandonment of evolutionary common sense. Possibly both. Their homeworld is a water-rich planet with laughably mild gravitational parameters, continued the intelligence briefing. Surface gravity approximately 60% of standard Imperial measurement. Their musculature has clearly adapted to these embarrassingly comfortable conditions. Most telling of all, they appear to have achieved interstellar travel without first conquering their entire home system through ritualized combat. This last observation prompted such vigorous head-shaking from the Council that several members risked minor concussion. The very idea of developing advanced technology through cooperation rather than systematic violence struck them as not just inefficient, but actively perverse. War Coordinator Vexnath gestured dismissively with one massive arm, inadvertently demolishing a nearby decorative pillar in the process. So we're dealing with soft-bodied pacifists, who've stumbled into space travel through sheer accident. Delightful. How shall we handle their inevitable request for mercy when they realize the nature of our response to their cultural exchange proposal? The human diplomatic vessel had maintained a respectful distance from the Imperial fleet, broadcasting messages that managed to be simultaneously polite and utterly oblivious to the realities of the situation. Their representative, who had identified herself only as ambassador without providing a proper threat assessment or intimidation credentials, had actually used phrases like mutual benefit and peaceful coexistence, with apparent sincerity. High Admiral Grixever had personally reviewed the human vessel's specifications and found them so underwhelming that he'd initially suspected the data was corrupted. Their ship mounted no visible weapons systems, carried minimal defensive capabilities, and appeared to prioritize fuel efficiency over the sort of menacing profile that any self-respecting starship should possess. It was like discovering that someone had tried to build a war machine out of flower petals and good intention. The humans have requested permission to send a single representative aboard our station, announced Communications Director Yithik, whose job primarily involved receiving surrender transmissions and forwarding them to the appropriate dismantling crew. They wish to discuss terms for what they're calling a formal cultural exchange program. The phrase formal cultural exchange program produced another round of laughter that probably registered on seismic monitoring equipment. The Vorthak had their own version of cultural exchange, which typically involved the systematic elimination of inconvenient cultural elements that interfered with efficient subjugation. Supreme War Coordinator Vexnoth's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching genuine enthusiasm. "Gentlemen," he announced with the sort of anticipatory glee typically associated with children discovering unguarded candy supplies, "I believe we have an opportunity to provide these humans with the most educational cultural exchange in their brief species history." The plan that emerged was so elegantly simple that it bordered on artistic. The human ambassador would be invited aboard the Imperial Command Station. With all appropriate diplomatic courtesy, they would be treated to a comprehensive tour of Vorthak civilization, culminating in a demonstration of their most cherished cultural institution, the trial by fire. "We'll explain the process thoroughly," Vexnoth continued, his tone suggesting the sort of patient condescension typically reserved for particularly slow students. "How combat prowess determines social hierarchy, how disputes are settled through ritualized violence, how the strong rule while the weak serve or become fertilizer." High Admiral Grixever nodded approvingly, "And when they inevitably express horror at our barbaric customs, we'll graciously offer them an alternative to immediate subjugation." The trial by Fang Defense Minister Kulthix concluded with obvious relish. "Single combat between their representative and our current champion. If they win, which is mathematically impossible, they earn the right to negotiate terms. If they lose, which is inevitable, their species joins the Empire as a tributary state." The beauty of the plan was its complete fairness. The humans would be given a genuine opportunity to prove their worth according to the only metric that mattered in galactic civilization. When they failed, as they inevitably must, the Empire could claim they had been both just and merciful in their dealings with the newcomers. Intelligence Chief Nexaril raised a tentative objection. "My lords, are we certain that Overlord Yixum won't simply end the contest too quickly? It might be more educational if the human lasted long enough to fully appreciate the magnitude of their species' miscalculation." War Coordinator Vexnoth waved dismissively. "Yixum is a professional. He understands the value of a properly paced demonstration. I'm confident he'll provide sufficient time for the human to contemplate the fundamental realities of galactic power structures before the inevitable conclusion." The betting pools opened within hours of the plan's approval. The odds on human victory were so astronomical that several bookmakers refused to accept wagers, citing concerns about taking advantage of the mentally impaired. The smart money was on how many seconds the contest would last, with the consensus clustering around not many. Imperial engineers began preparing the Eternal Arena for what promised to be the most one-sided educational demonstration in recent history. Camera arrays were positioned to capture every angle of the proceedings, for both historical documentation and entertainment value. Medical teams were placed on standby, though their expected role was less treatment and more cleanup. The invitation was transmitted to the human diplomatic vessel with all appropriate pomp and ceremony. The response came back within hours. Acceptance, delivered with the sort of enthusiastic gratitude that suggested the humans genuinely believed they were being honored rather than efficiently processed for subjugation. As the Vorthak Empire prepared to welcome their newest tributary species, the overwhelming sentiment throughout the hegemony was one of satisfied anticipation. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the natural order of things, to a species naive enough to believe in alternatives. The humans were about to receive the most comprehensive education in galactic realpolitik ever delivered. And like all the best lessons, it would be brief, decisive, and utterly unforgettable.
The Eternal Arena had hosted many spectacles over the millennia,
but rarely had it drawn such an enthusiastic crowd for what promised to be such a brief entertainment. Tiered seating carved from volcanic rock stretched upward into the crimson atmosphere of Dumanak's prime, packed with Vorthak nobility who had paid premium rates for what amounted to front-row seats to a traffic accident. The air thrummed with anticipation and the sort of bloodthirsty excitement typically associated with feeding time at particularly violent zoos. At the center of it all, Overlord Yaxthan the Inevitable performed his pre-combat ritual with the sort of methodical precision that had made him a legend. 8 feet of evolved murder. He moved through stretching exercises that would have qualified as lethal weapons demonstrations for most species. Each casual flex of his limbs produced sounds like artillery shells being loaded, while his retracted claws scraped furrows in the arena floor with every step. The Hegemarchy's finest had positioned themselves in the premium viewing boxes, their excitement barely contained behind facades of imperial dignity. Supreme War Coordinator Vexnoth leaned forward in his seat, his massive frame causing the reinforced balcony to emit concerning creaks. Has anyone established a betting pool on which specific bone breaks first? High Admiral Grixthor consulted his personal datapad, which had been buzzing with wager notifications for the past hour. Current favorites are the human's spine, followed closely by their skull, though there's an interesting side bet on whether Yaxthan will show mercy by making it quick. The arena's massive displays showed real-time odds that shifted by the second, though the movement was less fluctuation and more like watching an avalanche in slow motion. Human victory was listed at odds so remote that the numbers required scientific notation to display properly. The human representative entered through the challenger's gate with what could charitably be described as confidence, though it might have been simple ignorance of the laws of physics. Standing barely 6 feet tall, they possessed the sort of unremarkable physiology that suggested evolution had designed them during a particularly uninspired afternoon. No visible natural weapons, no intimidating musculature, no features that would make a predator think twice about selecting them for lunch. What was most striking about the human was their complete lack of appropriate fear. They surveyed the arena with the sort of casual interest typically reserved for tourist attractions, nodding appreciatively at the architectural details as if they were visiting a museum rather than preparing for ritualized dismemberment. Fascinating construction, the human observed to no one in particular, their voice carrying clearly in the arena's acoustically perfect environment. The stress distribution on those upper supports is quite elegant. Whoever designed this really understood load-bearing architecture. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of confusion and amusement. Here was a being about to face the galaxy's most efficient killing machine, and they were critiquing the engineering specifications. It was like watching someone compliment the wallpaper while standing in a burning building. Overlord Yaxthan approached his opponent with the measured stride of absolute certainty. 12 solar cycles of unbroken victories had given him an almost supernatural confidence in the inevitable outcome of any combat scenario. He had faced challenges from 17 different species, each bringing their own unique biological advantages, and had systematically demonstrated that evolution's creativity was no match for Vorthak's superiority. Human, he rumbled, his voice carrying the sort of casual menace that suggested volcanoes were probably jealous of his intimidation techniques. You face me in the trial by Thang. Do you understand what this means? The human tilted their head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both consideration and complete lack of concern. I believe the concept is fairly straightforward. We engage in combat until one of us is no longer capable of continuing. The winner gains the right to set terms for future interactions between our peoples. Correct, Yaxthan acknowledged with the sort of patient tone typically used when explaining obvious facts to small children. And you understand that in 137 previous contests, I have never been defeated. Yes, the human replied with what sounded suspiciously like genuine interest. Quite an impressive record. Though I suppose every streak has to end eventually, doesn't it? The crowd's laughter was so loud it probably registered on orbital monitoring stations. The sheer audacity of the statement was entertaining enough to be almost endearing. Here was a creature that looked like it might have trouble opening a particularly stubborn jar, discussing statistical inevitability with the galaxy's most efficient death delivery system. Yaxthan extended his claws with a sound like swords being unsheathed, each gleaming talon capable of punching through starship armor. Indeed it does, little human. Though not to. The combat began with Yaxthan's traditional opening move, a lightning-fast strike designed to end contests before they became tiresome. His right arm swept toward the human's torso with enough force to liquefy most known materials. Claws extended to ensure maximum efficiency. The human wasn't there, not dodged, not stumbled backward, not frantically scrambled away, simply not there, as if they had momentarily decided to exist somewhere else entirely. Yaxthan's strike carved through empty air, while his opponent materialized 3 feet to his left, having somehow relocated without appearing to move. First strike, the human observed conversationally, as if commenting on weather patterns. Interesting technique, though the telegraphing could use some work. The crowd's laughter died abruptly. This wasn't part of the expected script. Humans were supposed to be slow, clumsy, unable to match Vorthak reflex. They weren't supposed to treat the galaxy's most feared predator like a mildly interesting puzzle to be solved. Yaxthan's second attack was a combination strike, claws from both hands converging on the human's position, while his powerful legs prepared to deliver a follow-up kick that would have reduced most opponents to constituent atoms. It was a move that had never failed, a perfect demonstration of Vorthak combat superiority, refined over countless victories. The human stepped inside the attack pattern, somehow finding the geometrically impossible safe space between converging death. Their left hand touched Yaxthan's wrist, barely a tap, really. But the Overlord's entire arm suddenly wasn't responding to neural commands. His right claw strike became an awkward flail while confusion replaced certainty in his predatory mind. Second strike, the human continued in the same maddeningly calm tone. Nerve disruption, temporary, but effective. You might want to consider the tactical implications of overcommitting to attacks. The arena had fallen completely silent. 20,000 Vorthak spectators watched their invincible champion stumble slightly, his right arm hanging useless at his side. This was impossible. Humans didn't know advanced combat techniques. They were prey animals who had accidentally achieved space travel. Yaxthan's third attack was born of desperation disguised as fury. Using his still functional left arm, he launched himself forward in a move that combined all his remaining strength into a single devastating strike. It was less technique than raw violence, the sort of attack that relied on overwhelming force to compensate for reduced precision. The human caught his wrist, not deflected, not avoided, caught, with what appeared to be casual effort. Yaxthan's devastating strike stopped as if it had encountered an immovable object. His massive form suddenly locked in place by a grip that looked deceptively gentle. Third strike, the human said, and for the first time there was something other than casual interest in their voice, something that suggested the educational portion of the afternoon was concluding. Pressure point manipulation, specifically the radial nerve cluster. This will hurt. They squeezed. Overlord Yaxthan, the inevitable, undefeated champion of the eternal arena, terror of 17 star systems and the galaxy's most perfect killing machine, screamed. It was not a roar of rage or a battle cry of defiance. It was the sound of a creature experiencing pain so complete and overwhelming that his nervous system temporarily forgot how to process anything else. The human released their grip and stepped back as Yaxthan collapsed, both arms now completely non-functional, and his legendary pain tolerance utterly overwhelmed. The entire sequence, 3 precise strikes delivered with surgical accuracy, had taken exactly 10 hot. The silence in the arena was so complete that the ambient sound of Dominax Prime's atmospheric processors could be heard clearly. 20,000 Vorthak stared at their fallen champion, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The human brushed imaginary dust from their hands and looked up at the packed stands with the sort of polite attention typically reserved for formal introductions. So, they said into the stunned quiet, their voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustic system, about that cultural exchange program. I believe we have some things to discuss. The Imperial Council chamber had hosted many emergency sessions over the millennia, but never one quite like this. The same officials who had been laughing themselves into respiratory distress just hours earlier, now sat in the sort of stunned silence typically associated with survivors of natural disaster. The holographic displays that usually showed triumphant conquest statistics had been hastily switched to damage assessment protocols. Though the damage in question was less physical infrastructure, and more the complete collapse of everything they had believed about the fundamental nature of reality. Supreme War Coordinator Vexnot stared at the replay footage for the 47th time, his massive form hunched over the tactical display like a student cramming for an exam they were destined to fail catastrophically. The recording showed the same impossible sequence: 3 precise strikes, 10 heartbeats, and the systematic dismantling of everything the Vorthak Empire had built its identity around. "Explain this to me again," he rumbled, his voice carrying the sort of dangerous quiet that suggested volcanic eruptions were taking notes on proper intimidation technique. "Our champion, our undefeated, biologically superior, evolutionarily perfect champion, was defeated by a creature that looks like it was designed by committee, during a particularly uninspired afternoon." Intelligence Chief Nexeril shuffled through his hastily compiled reports with the desperate energy of someone trying to find good news in a tax audit. "The preliminary analysis suggests that human combat doctrine operates on principles we hadn't previously encountered, my lord. They appear to prioritize efficiency over brute force, precision over overwhelming strength." "Precision, High Admiral Grix," Vor repeated the word like it was a foreign concept requiring translation. "They defeated raw evolutionary superiority with precision." The footage continued its relentless loop on the main display. There was the human, standing calmly while Yexthan charged with enough force to demolish a small building. There was the impossible evasion that seemed to violate several laws of physics. There was the casual nerve strike that had turned the galaxy's most feared predator into a study in sudden helplessness. Defense Minister Kalthix leaned back in his reinforced chair, which creaked ominously under the combined weight of his bulk and his gradually dawning comprehension. "Has anyone considered the possibility that we may have made certain assumptions about human capabilities based on incomplete data?" The question hung in the air like a particularly malodorous gas cloud. The Vorthak Empire's entire assessment of humanity had been built on the sort of surface-level analysis that would have embarrassed a first-year military academy student. They had looked at human physiology and seen weakness, when they should have been asking why a species with such apparent disadvantages had achieved interstellar travel at all. "Bring me everything," Vexnot commanded, his tone suggesting that failure to comply would result in a demonstration of traditional Vorthak problem-solving techniques. "Every intelligence report, every scan of their vessel, every communication intercept. I want to know what we missed." What they had missed, as it turned out, was practically everything important. The human diplomatic vessel, which they had dismissed as laughably underarmed, carried sensor packages that had been quietly analyzing Vorthak technology, biology, and combat techniques since the moment of first contact. The primitive construction materials were actually advanced composites that prioritized functionality over intimidation, a design philosophy that struck the assembled War Council as fundamentally alien. More disturbing were the energy signatures their deep space monitoring stations had detected from the direction of human space. What the Empire had initially catalogued as background stellar radiation was actually the exhaust trails of a military fleet that made their own dreadnoughts look like decorative lawn ornaments. The humans had been conducting training exercises in their home system while maintaining peaceful diplomatic contact, which suggested a level of strategic thinking that the Vorthak found genuinely unsettling. "Their homeworld analysis requires significant revision," Nexeril reported, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone discovering that everything they thought they knew was embarrassingly wrong. "Initial scans detected minimal military infrastructure, but enhanced analysis suggests we were looking at civilian installations. Their actual defensive capabilities appear to be considerable." The term considerable was intelligence speak for "we're probably all going to die horribly." The Vorthak had built their empire on the simple principle that superior firepower solved all problems, but the humans appeared to have taken that concept and refined it into something approaching art form. Communications Director Yathik raised a tentative hand, a gesture that suggested he was about to deliver news that would make everyone's day significantly worse. "My lords, we've been receiving transmissions from human space. They appear to be concerned about their ambassador's well-being." The transmission log made for fascinating reading, in the same way that impending natural disasters were fascinating. The initial messages had been polite inquiries about diplomatic protocols and cultural exchange procedure. The more recent communications carried undertones that suggested the humans were prepared to take a more direct interest in their representatives' safety if satisfactory responses were not forthcoming. "Define direct interest,"
Vexnot requested with the sort of careful calm that suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Approximately 47 human vessels have taken up positions at the edge of our territory, Yathik replied, consulting his displays with obvious reluctance. They're maintaining what they describe as defensive postures, while awaiting word from their ambassador. 47 vessels. The Vorthak Empire maintained border patrols with squadrons of 12 ships, considering that more than adequate to discourage casual aggression. The humans had deployed nearly 4 times that number, as a precautionary measure. High Admiral Grixfor pulled up tactical displays of the human fleet positions, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching professional respect. Look at these formations, he muttered, highlighting the geometric precision of the human deployment. Perfect overlapping fields of fire, optimal response positioning, redundant command structures. This isn't posturing, this is competence. The realization hit the assembled council like a particularly well-aimed asteroid. The humans weren't primitive newcomers stumbling into galactic civilization. They were an established military power that had been politely knocking on the door while keeping their weapons ready, just in case the neighbors turned out to be less friendly than advertised. We need to reconsider our entire approach, Vexnot announced, the words emerging with the sort of painful effort typically associated with major surgery performed without anesthesia. It appears that humanity may not be the easy conquest we had anticipated. The understatement of the millennium hung in the air, while the Vorthak leadership grappled with concepts that challenged everything they had built their civilization around. For 3,000 years they had been the apex predators of known space, the final word in any discussion about galactic power structures. Now they were faced with the possibility that they might not even be in the top tier of the food chain. Defense Minister Kalthix gestured toward the still looping arena footage. The humans' combat techniques suggest extensive study of our physiology and fighting methods. They knew exactly where to strike for maximum effectiveness while minimizing permanent damage. This wasn't lucky improvisation, this was surgical precision based on comprehensive intelligence. The implications were staggering. While the Vorthak had been laughing at human diplomatic overtures, humanity had been conducting the sort of detailed analysis that preceded either very successful negotiations. The ambassador's casual dismantling of their champion hadn't been a fluke. It had been a carefully calculated demonstration of capability. Sir, Communications Director Yathik announced with obvious reluctance. We're receiving another transmission from the human fleet. They're requesting an update on diplomatic proceedings and suggesting that Yanchin delays might necessitate alternative approaches to ensuring their representatives' safety. The phrase alternative approaches carried the sort of ominous undertones that suggested the humans had given considerable thought to contingency planning. The Vorthak Empire suddenly found itself in the unprecedented position of needing to consider the preferences of their guests rather than simply processing them for efficient subjugation. Supreme War Coordinator, Vexnot, looked around the council chamber at faces that reflected his own growing comprehension of their situation. The apex predators had encountered something they had never expected to find in the galaxy competition. Gentlemen, he announced with the sort of grim resolve typically reserved for funeral orations, I believe it's time we learned about this cultural exchange concept, and perhaps we should approach these negotiations with a somewhat more collaborative attitude than we had originally planned. The irony was not lost on any of them. The Vorthak Empire, which had spent millennia teaching the galaxy about the realities of power, was about to receive their own education in the fundamental principle that somewhere in the universe, there was always a bigger fish, and sometimes that fish was deceptively small, disturbingly polite, and capable of landing 3 strikes in 10 heartbeats.